Brothers and sisters, good evening. We've been looking at Samuel intermittently, I think. The last time was probably 4 weeks ago perhaps, but just to reassess or refamiliarise ourselves with the area of the scripture that we are just considering. Turn back with me to 1 Samuel chapter 10. We're considering the man Saul, the king the people desired, and we're introduced to Samuel taking this vial of oil and poured it upon the head of Saul and kissed him and said, "Is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance?" And so we are introduced to Saul and the various signs which are given to him to encourage him on the right way. And verse 3, then shalt thou go on forward from thence, thou shalt come to the plain of Tabor, there shall meet thee 3 men going up to God, to Bethel, one carrying 3 kids, and another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a bottle of wine. They will salute thee and give thee 2 loaves of bread, which thou shalt receive of their hands. And after that thou shalt come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines, and I believe that's significant. And it shall come to pass, when thou art come thither to the city, that thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with a psaltery and a tabret, pipe and harp before them, and they shall prophesy. And so the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul in that experience also, and we get this rather peculiar proverb later on in the chapter, is Saul also among the prophets? So Saul is anointed to be the king over God's people. You remember how the people are desirous for a king, that they might be like the nations that are around them. Well, there is not too much warmth initially, it seems, to the appointment of Saul, but something dramatic and significant occurs in chapter 11. We're introduced to Nahash, the Ammonite, who comes up and encamps against Jabesh Gilead, makes war against, or threatens to make war against that particular place, and messengers are sent to Saul requesting help and so on. So the messengers of Gibeah, then came the messengers to Gibeah of Saul, verse 4, told the tidings in the ears of the people, all the people wept. Saul came after the herd out of the field, discovers the cause of the weeping and so on. Verse 6, the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard these tidings. His anger was kindled greatly. He took a yoke of oxen, hewed them in pieces, sent the pieces throughout the land to gather together the armies of Israel. And this galvanizes the nation to action. And they come, and the battle is joined. Nahash and the Ammonites are routed, and Saul is exalted, and this the position of Saul suddenly changes. Verse 12, the people said unto Samuel, "Who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death." And Saul said, "There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel." So there clearly was an animosity or a reluctance to appoint Saul properly as the king and be accepted as the king. But with this great military victory, the thing that they've been looking for, suddenly Saul is our man, he is our king, and we are absolutely going to follow him, is the thrust, I believe, of what occurs. And on the basis of this military victory, there is a desire to go and renew the kingdom. Verse 14 of chapter 11, then said Samuel to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." It was time to re-energize and appoint Saul as the leader, as the king. And so Samuel gives his address in verse 12 to set forth his righteousness before the people and his integrity The people acknowledge his integrity in all of these things as he recounts some of the history of the people. And the commitment is made that they might serve the Lord and appoint Saul as the king. And so we are presented with chapter 13 and verse 1. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, thus and so. How long did Saul reign? If you search the Samuel and Kings records, you will search in vain, it seems to me. Acts in chapter 13 gives us the answer as near as may be. Acts chapter 13, because there's a problem with chapter 13 and verse 1. So we have Paul preaching, and at verse 20, after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet, so we're very familiar with him. And afterward they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king. So Saul, I suggest to you, is reigning on the throne for some 40 years. So, turn back with me to chapter 13 of Samuel. How long has Saul been reigning at the point at which we now find ourselves? And indeed, when does the reign of Saul actually begin? We've had the anointing of Saul in the very first instance, but then we've got this battle with Nahash and the military victory which occurs then, and the renewing of the kingdom which occurs at the end of chapter 11. So does the beginning of Saul's reign occur at that point? The various translators have a great deal of difficulty with chapter 13 and verse 1. The numbers, oddly, are incomplete in the various manuscripts, and so various attempts have been made to make this into a greater number of years because it has this construction style of the King's records in general, where it gives you the period of time of the reign of the king, but nowhere else in the record concerning Saul does that occur. So did all these things happen in the first year, relative to the battle with Nahash or not? And there's a kind of, lots of ink has been written on or used in writing concerning this, and I'm not sure I've got a particular resolution for it, to the point where actually I think one manuscript misses it out altogether. So did these things happen on the previous year? Possibly so. And there seems to be a turning point at the point of his reign as we then introduced to what Saul actually does. He brings together a number of troops. Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel. This seems to me to be the standing army that are supporting Saul. There are 3,000 men of Israel. There are 2,000 with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 of that 3,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. Of course, when he'd cut up the yoke of oxen, sent the pieces, gathered the army out of the country, there were a great company. There's an extremely large army, which Saul manages to bring together, verse 8 of chapter 11, there were 300,000 and the men of Judah 30,000. That's an extremely large army. 300,000 fighting men are brought together to conquer Nahash, and conquer him they do. But an extremely large army that's referred to there. And after these events, as the rest of the verse 2 goes on to say, the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. So it seems to me we get the idea of this large army congregated, the battle is joined, Nahash is defeated, the kingdom is renewed, Saul is at the head of the nation, but there's a general dispersal, and Saul keeps to himself these 3,000, 2,000 with himself, and 1,000 with Jonathan. Now, how old was Jonathan is my next challenge. How old is Saul? Actually, we don't know, and it is rather curious. Reflect on the choosing of Saul, and he's introduced to us as somewhat diffident and shy. He's not willing to necessarily promote himself. He's of a poor family in Israel, and I suspect that we have the view that Saul is a relatively young man. But what occurs here in chapter 13 and verse 3 is Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines. Jonathan is the son of Saul. So he's got to be, surely, in his 20s, and Saul presumably is in his 30s, 40s. I don't know. We just do not know, it seems to me. But I think it's just thinking about the ages of the individuals and helps to fill out some of the context of what's going on. Now, verse 3, we are introduced to Jonathan, and we have the mention of the garrison. Now, we mentioned in passing the garrison that Saul had the excursion by back in chapter 10. So the garrison of the Philistines, verse 5 of chapter 10, was very particularly mentioned. I don't think, again, there's any accident in that. The Philistines are a strong people. They have an outpost, a garrison, that's bang in the middle of the Judean hills. And it's well known and appreciated what is there. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines. By the way, it's a different event. Despite me mentally trying to join them together, I can't. Chapter 14 and verse 6. You remember Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armour, "Come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or few." And we remember how he, with his armour bearer, looks for a sign. They go up, they slay these 20, I think it is, in this garrison. But the events are clearly different because of what follows. So we know as chapter 14 develops that Saul is not with them. Saul is not privy to the situation. They have to be different events. As I did try some little while to try and piece them together, but it doesn't seem to work for me. So we have this introduction to Jonathan. He's clearly a very amiable character. He is the lead in this particular situation. A military strategist and something of great prowess. So Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. The Philistines heard it, you bet they did. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul, notice that, had smitten a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also was had in abomination with the Philistines, and the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. So the Philistines undoubtedly heard it. We have a garrison installed in the Judean hills to keep control of their interests in the area. And Jonathan has gone and smitten this particular garrison outpost, and there's trouble brewing, isn't there? There is a declaration of war, effectively. Now again, the fact that Saul blows the trumpet here, there's a contrast, isn't there, between Saul blowing the trumpet and what had happened previously with the cutting up of the oxen, sending them out through the land to gather the army. In whatever has happened in the interim, we have some degree of organisation and communication structure that's built up. The blowing of the trumpet, the signals are sent out, and the army is brought together by a much more structured way, I suggest. And so the trumpet is blown, let the Hebrews hear. Hebrews are those that had crossed over. And we'll see a little bit more of that in a moment. So the army is brought together. Saul, we notice, has smitten a garrison of the Philistines, but it was Jonathan which had accomplished the military victory in the first instance. But Saul is the king and recognised to be so. And so whatever disputes had been there in the past, Saul is now recognised as being the leader of the people. Now the mention of the particular locations of Michmash, Geba and the various others, when you look at the map, it does all seem to sort of flow together. It's very indistinct, and you find that Saul is in Michmash in verse 2, and yet later on the Philistines, verse 5, they gather themselves together and they pitch in Michmash. Just exactly how close the two armies are is impossible for me to work out, but there does seem to be a sort of a fluid movement over this area of the country. And so the Philistines indeed gathered themselves together, having lost their garrison outpost. War has to be engaged in, and they gathered together to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So never mind about the people, we can't count those. There's 30,000 chariots. Now again, the translators have and the commentators have some difficulty with this. The language of the original is actually, in fairness, quite unclear with regard to the 30,000 chariots. 30,000 chariots is even bigger than any of the armies that have ever tried to fight that is known of. More likely it is 3,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and the language of the Hebrew allows both to occur. It's a rather indistinct translation, it seems. But be that as it may, the army is gathered and Israel find themselves in a great strait. There's a sudden, perhaps, realisation of just what level of battle they're about to be engaged upon. Smiting the garrison which is in your locality, that's kind of okay, but the provocation, the Philistines heard it, gathered their troops, mustered the troops, and the Saul and his people suddenly realise the situation that they're in. And as we've read already, the people were distressed, verse 6, and they hid themselves in high places in pits, and Saul now sees his army melting away from him. Verse 7, and some of the Hebrews went over Jordan. And it's one of those curious features of the Hebrew language. Hebrews is those that crossed over. It's first used concerning Abraham. And the went over is actually a variation of crossed over or Hebrew. So the Hebrews Hebrewed the Jordan. They crossed over, as it were, twice over. And Saul remains steadfast in Gilgal, but the people that followed him did so trembling. And then we come to what is the pivotal point or the thing of the chapter. He, Saul, verse 8, tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed, but Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So we see again that how Saul is losing track, losing control of his army. He's had a terrific victory with Nahash. The people have initially rallied behind him, but in this situation now, when they see the size of the Philistine army which has come against them, they suddenly realise that they're no match for him, or for them. So, tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. When did Samuel make this appointment? Well, have a look with me at chapter 10 and verse 7. 8. That's why I've said verse 7. Yes, because it starts at verse 7. Let it be, when these signs are come unto thee, that thou do as occasion serve thee, for God is with thee. And I think that's significant. Thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down unto thee to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee and show thee what thou shalt do. There is a striking connection between the two things, and the way in which they're recorded for us, they have to be connected surely. But we have this time problem between the two events, it seems to me, which I haven't necessarily fully reconciled in my mind, because in between chapters 10 and 13 we have the battle with Nahash, and we've got various things which have occurred which is longer than 7 days. Of that there is no doubt. But I want to come back to verse 5 of chapter 10, and we remember noticing the mention of the garrison of the Philistines. And then at verse 7, let it be, when these signs are come unto thee, that thou do as occasion serve thee, for God is with thee. And I wonder, and I think I want it to be so, but I can't prove this, I wonder whether the doing as occasion serve thee is actually the battle concerning the destruction of the garrison of the Philistines, which occurs between himself and Jonathan. Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines. That was to be, I believe, the beginning of this time period for the 7 days. So the smiting of the garrison of the Philistines, which occurs in verse 3, and the various events which then follow, allows relatively comfortably this idea of arriving at the 7 days, waiting for Samuel to appear. And in Saul's belief, Samuel isn't going to come. This is where his faith becomes inadequate for the task which is there. So I haven't got that fully formulated, but I think there's something going on with this chapter 10 verse 5 in the garrison of the Philistines, doing as occasion served thee in verse 7, and the 7 days which are there mentioned. Perhaps have the opportunity to explore that further later. And so the situation is as we have read in verse 8, and the people scatter from him. Saul says, bring a burnt offering to me, peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offering. And we can see readily the presumption which Saul makes here, taking to himself the responsibility which was for the priests alone. He offered the burnt offering. And so verse 10 we find Samuel arrives. It's almost this sort of poetic thing. As soon as the offering is made, Samuel turns up, and it's still within the 7 days. Again, of that there's no doubt. The language of the 7 days, which occurs early on in verse 8, is the beginning of the day. So what we're seeing is Saul's lack of faith concerning Samuel's ability to turn up and to make the offerings at the right time. As it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Saul went out to meet him that he might salute him. The response which Samuel gives is a classic technique of the scriptures, and a very powerful set of questions. What hast thou done? Recognise the question, don't we? Let's do a quick bit of Bible page turning. Genesis 3 and verse 13. Genesis 3:13. The Lord God said unto the woman, what is this that thou hast done? The woman said, the serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. She had an excuse for the what hast thou done. It's not my fault, it was the serpent. The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Chapter 4 of Genesis. These are the first occurrences of this particular structure. What hast thou done? Genesis 4 and I've lost it, verse 10. The Lord said, verse 9, unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And Genesis 12 and verse 18, Pharaoh speaking to Abram concerning Sarah. Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? So what hast thou done occurs these few times, and the question is intended to provoke a realization on the part of the transgressor, isn't it? Questioning in that way is an extremely powerful way of creating in the heart of, or in the mind of the listener, the transgressor, that attitude of repentance and the opportunity to confess. Saul, interestingly, uses exactly the same construction, chapter 14, verse 43. We didn't want to transgress into that chapter too far, but chapter 14 and verse 43, Saul said to Jonathan, tell me, what hast thou done? Jonathan told him and said, I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in mine hand, and lo, I must die. So again, the same questioning technique is there used. So, presented with the question, what sort of response is Saul going to give? Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed. Oh, it's your fault. And that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore I said, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. So he's weakened by the dispersal of the people. Samuel has not come, and Saul loses his confidence in the situation. And he can see the Philistine army, and he's overwhelmed by the situation which is against him. And this is the extraordinary and the acute test of faith which is presented to Saul. And it's almost as though he blames Samuel for not turning up at the time that he wanted him to be there. And he seeks to justify himself. I haven't made supplication unto the Lord. What did you expect me to do? And I forced myself. It wasn't an easy thing. And the language actually is I was constrained. And the language is exactly that. You know, I forced myself. This is what Saul says. And it's a consideration of this that you realise that in the everyday events of our lives, extraordinary though Saul is as the king of Israel, nonetheless, the things which are presented to him, that test of obedience, is no different, really, for any of us. No, we're not necessarily fighting against the Philistines on the Judean hills, and we don't necessarily have the requirement to wait for the 7 days before an offering is made and so on. But we have commandments nonetheless, don't we? We have obligations in the calling of our God. And in the face of terrific challenge, the people are scattered. Samuel hasn't turned up. I haven't made an offering to God. I need to protect these people. I'm the king. You can imagine the dilemma that would be in Saul's mind. And yet, instead of his faith holding as strong as it needed to be, he weakened. He says, I saw the situation, I feared, and maybe this is harsh, I don't know. It's almost as though I didn't believe you would come. And again, I think that's a potentially powerful exhortation for us. I didn't believe that the Master would come today. But he's promised through the word that he will come. We don't have the 7 days, but we must be faithful in waiting for him. But it's these seemingly innocuous things, the tests which come to Saul in this place, and for us also, quite normal things that we are engaged upon. And verse 11 gives us a similar sort of construction. 15 verse 11 or verse 10. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he is turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. So it is this inability to keep the commandment which has lost Saul the kingdom. And as Samuel then goes on to say, For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom. But the acceptance into this kingdom was predicated on his obedience to the commandment given. Thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. And so we begin to be introduced to the contrasts which are set out for us with Saul and with David. David, a man after God's own heart, and that reference is picked up again in Acts 13 that we briefly looked at earlier on. And so, verse 15, Samuel arose, gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin. Saul numbered the people that were present with him. Count these now, about 600 men. He started off with 300,000 in the very beginning. He had 3,000 with him, 2,000 were with himself, 1,000 with Jonathan. He now has but 600. Samuel has gone. Saul and Jonathan, verse 16, and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. They established themselves, they were stronger than ever. And with this degree of confidence, shall we say, which the Philistines have, spoilers are sent out of the camp, verse 17, and they raid in various different directions and weaken the Israelites who are there. And so as the chapter begins to draw to a conclusion, we find that there is no smith found throughout all the land of Israel. They're not able to look after the implements of warfare. They don't have the ability to wage war at the right level. And the Philistines have a degree of oppression, lest the Hebrews, it goes on to say, make themselves swords or spears. But they can look after the agricultural implements only, which is indeed what they do. And of course, one of the methods of warfare in days gone by was to let your enemy grow the crops, go and invade and take the crops from them. And we know that that's what was happening with one of the earlier judges, with Samson. And so the garrison of the Philistines, verse 23, went out to the passage of Michmash, which leads then into the situation and the victory which then follows later on in chapter 14. So the heading which we had was concerning Saul's failure. He had a test of faith. He had his weaknesses, most certainly, and those weaknesses he acknowledged early on. Perhaps he was lifted up in pride with his initial victory over Nahash the Ammonite, perhaps so. But there was a test of his faith. He was given a very particular set of commands to observe. And Samuel is angry with Saul, and his kingship is effectively taken away. The exhortation that we can obtain from these things is to consider for our own lives the challenges which come against us, the tests of our faith and obedience as we wait for the coming of the Son of Man. Thank you.